everyone. I welcome you to CEC lecture series. I'm Nupur Chawla, teaching English literature at Maitri College, Delhi University. Today's lecture is titled William Carlos Williams, the 20th Century American Poet. And this lecture is part of the ongoing series on 20th century poetry. So in the previous lectures, we have been, discussing, and we have discussed already a lot of poets, English poets who were writing in the 20th century. So in this series, we aim to understand that how did the genre of poetry flourish or exist in the 20th century, what have been its characteristic features, what are the different literary movements or trends that impacted the writing of poetry, and how each poet experiments with the form or makes the form his or her own in order to suit their purpose and writing style, right? So that is what we have been discussing in this series by taking examples of various poets. And today's lecture is going to discuss yet another poet of the 20th century, that is William Carlos Williams. Now I'm sure a lot of you who are a bit familiar, even if a bit familiar with American literature, you would have come across this poet, because Carlos Williams is actually a 20th century American poet. Right? Now, he was actually born in 1883, which is the end of the 19th century, in Rutherford, New Jersey. Right? And then he studied at the University of Pennsylvania Medical School, where he also met two other very important poets of 20th century, that is Ezra Pound and Hilda Doolittle. Now, those of you who are familiar with 20th century literature would have come across the references to Ezra Pound and Hilda Doolittle. And of course, Ezra Pound we all remember for another reason, that is, he gave this phrase that became kind of a catchphrase for literary modernism, that is, quote unquote, make it new, right? So this phrase, then summarized the aesthetic or the one can say that the experiments with form and aesthetic and content that we witness with literary modernism, right? And both these poets, Ezra Pound and Hilda Doolittle, are also names that are directly associated with the sub-literary movement within modernism, that is Imagism. Right? Now, we'll of course talk about all of this at length, but this is just to tell you that how Carlos Williams was in touch with these two other poets as well, of the 20th century. Now, you see, after receiving his degree, his medical degree in 1906, Williams actually decided to do both, that is, practice medicine and write poetry. Right? So you see, once we get to know the background of the poet, it helps us understand that first, of course, it helps us understand the imagination of the poet, and also, most importantly, what are the kind of experiences that would have shaped the sensibility of that particular writer or poet, right? Now, you see, if we talk about the first collection of William Carlos Williams, that was published around 1908, which means early 20th century. But you see, it did not get a very favorable response. And then his second collection, that is titled Tempers, and that was published in 1913. It was released in London. Right? So we see that how William Carlos Williams then is an early 20th century poet. Now, the other thing that we need to know about Carlos Williams is that he accepted the fact that he was working under the influence of English poets. So you see, the British poets, the English poets, or the British poets had a far-reaching impact on Carlos Williams, and he himself also agrees to that. And let us look at this little quotation by Carlos Williams, where he talks about this. He says, and I quote, "I should have written about things around me, but I just did not know. I knew nothing of language except what I had heard in Keats and the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood." Unquote. Now, it is quite a, I would say, an honest confession. He says that while yes, I should have written a bit more about things around me, but he says that I had more exposure to the kind of writing that was done by John Keats. And John Keats, I'm sure all of us know about him, that he is one of the very famous British romantic poets, right? And he says, so I had Carlos Williams says that he had heard of John Keats, and he had been kind of very closely reading Keats and also pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. Now you see, pre-Raphaelites were again a group of poets who were writing very close to the Victorian period, and their poetry was also of a particular kind. So we notice that how these were the kind of poets that Carlos Williams himself was writing, and he openly acknowledges the influence of these on his writings. Right now, if you look at check your screens, we see that is Carlos Williams. That's the image of the poet. That's what he looked like in the early 20th century, when he was I would say that during his heyday, when he was established as a seminal poet. Now you see, apart from that, we just discussed that how his first poetry collection came out in 1908, and it was in 1918 that his collection actually that the other collection became actually famous. But along with that, you see, we've noticed that Carlos Williams was a prolific poet. He has multiple poetry collections to his credit. The next one is Cora in Hell, that was written in 1920. Sour Grapes, which was written in 1921. Spring and All, written in 1923. The Desert Music and Other Poems, 1954. Pictures from Bruegel and Other Poems, 1962. And Patterson in 1963. So you see, this of course is just a suggestive list, but what we notice here is that a poet that started writing in 1908 kept on writing till the 1960s, right? So this tells us that he is a poet who is prolific and who has a lot of poems to his credit, and whose I would say the literary career has a considerable span. Coming to the next point, we need to see what are some of the distinctive features of Williams's poetry. The first thing we say is that Carlos Williams captures the lived reality in his poems as it manifested physically, right? So, however you and I would experience reality firsthand in day-to-day lives, that is how, or those are the kind of things that he would write about or represent in his poems. Next, we see that he also portrays ordinary scenes, humans, objects from urban or semi-urban spaces. Now, when we say that, he talks about or he portrays ordinary scenes, humans, objects from urban and semi-urban spaces, this tells us what is the locale of Carlos Williams's poetry. It's not that he is creating imaginative worlds. He is very well basing the poems in reality and capturing ordinary scenes, humans and objects from both the cities and also the non-city spaces, right? A third thing that we also say about his poetry and his features is that his poetry was different from that of the other modernists such as T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound. He used, now you see, you should wonder that what is it that set apart William Carlos Williams's poems from the other modernist poems. Now you see, he used spontaneous language. When you read his poetry, you get a sense that the language that he uses is very effortless, right? It is as if it came naturally to the poet, and there's not a lot of stylization, so to say. While when you look at the high modernists such as T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound, they use a very self-conscious literary style. Now, what do we mean by self-conscious literary style? It means that we it is able to notice, one is able to notice that, there is a particular form that the poet is subscribing to. The poet is conscious about the way sentences are constructed, the kind of words that are being chosen, how is something being represented or talked about. But stating this again, Carlos Williams then, despite being a modernist, he, subscribed to this literary trend in a way that was slightly different from the others. Now, having looked at broadly what are his, what are the features of his poetry, let us take a brief look also at the literary background of this poet. Literary background as in what are the movements that he is associated with, what are the influences that this poet had. So, the first thing that we say is that Williams is often associated with the Imagist movement in modernist poetry. Now, if you remember that this is something that we had mentioned in the beginning of the lecture as well, that he is an Imagist poet. Now, what was Imagism exactly? The foremost thing that we say is that it is one of the sub-movements within modernism or within the cultural movement of modernism, right? And it is regarded as one of the early literary movements within modernism that flourished in early 20th century. So, that's the time period that poets writing in the early 20th century seem to have this similarity of the features that come under Imagism. Now, we need to understand further that what were the defining features of the Imagist poets. Now, you see, the Imagist poets, they adopted a particular aesthetic which involved a directness of image and economy of language. Now, you see, these two are very important phrases for us to understand what Imagism is or the features of an Imagist poem. First is the directness of image, second, the economy of language. Now, what do we mean by both these terms? Directness of image would mean that in the poem, we would see that you would notice that the poet creates very sharp images. He evokes images within the poem per se, right? These are images which are sharp, which are direct, which are very clearly drawn out, which are distinguished from, let's say all other words or utterances in the poem. So, very clearly we see images or pictures or word pictures as we call them drawn out in these poems. The next thing is economy of language. Now, what do we mean by the word economy of language? Economy means using wisely, right? So, language then was very carefully used by the Imagist poets, and still more importantly, they would use fewer words and convey a lot more, right? So, that is what we mean by economy of language. You would not see, you will not notice in Imagist poems, long sentences. Sentences are short, phrases are short, but they convey a lot more, right? So these two are important features of Imagism, but of course, I mean, we can go on talking about Imagism, but we need to focus on Carlos Williams's poems, and perhaps then through his work, we will further discuss more, what makes him an Imagist poet. Now, the next thing that we say about the literary background of this poet also is that he is known, Carlos Williams is known to only partially adopt the characteristics of the movement of Imagism. In fact, he carried his own brand of modernist experiment in poetry. While yes, he is known as a very famous imagist, but at the same time, we must understand that he did not subscribe to the movement completely. There were aspects where he departed from the conventions of this literary trend, right? Next thing that we see also is that Carlos Williams was influenced also by the European avant-garde movement. Now, once again, I will take you to the beginning of the lecture. Remember, we discussed that how he talks about that the British poets have a seminal influence or have had a seminal influence on him. We see yet another influence of the of the European writing, that is particularly of the European avant-garde movement. Now, what was avant-garde movement? It actually vouched for experimentation in art and writing and breaking away from traditions and trying new ways of expressing. These were some of the defining features of the avant-garde movement. Now, again, this was a cultural movement that we saw flourishing in literature, in arts, in architecture also to a large extent. Now, if you look at the term itself, avant-garde, it's actually a French term where the word avant means advance and garde means from the English word G-U-A-R-D. So it basically is a term that was used to refer to the soldiers who lead an entire army. So now you might wonder that why do we use this phrase to talk about a literary or a cultural movement? That is because around the time of 1920s, there was a lot of experiment going on in arts and literature. So this movement is considered to have inaugurated this spirit of experimenting in art, in writing, and also breaking away from the traditions or what was the existing structures and forms of expression, and through that trying new ways of expressing one's ideas or thoughts. So you see, William Carlos Williams then was also influenced by this movement as well. But here you might wonder that he is an American poet, but he has immense European influence, right? But we must understand that despite these influences, Williams preserved American experience in his poetry without giving in to the to the European literary and artistic conventions. So it's not that he was totally consumed in European structures, but he also very well did justice and did preserve American experience in his poems as well, right? So these are some of the things that we understand about the literary background of the poet. Just to very quickly kind of do a recap. First is that he adopted a particular aesthetic which involved a directness of image and economy of language, and therefore we say that he was an imagist poet as well. Second, we said that even as he did adopt the characteristics of this sub-movement, but he did not completely subscribe to them. Third, we said that how Carlos Williams was also influenced by the European avant-garde movement, which vouched for experimentation in art and writing. Fourth, we said that he also did preserve, to a large extent, American experience in his poetry. Right? Now, we need to, at the same time, having established these points, very quickly talk about what do we mean by modernism. Now, you see, we all are aware that how modernism is a cultural movement that flourished in Europe. Now, what is it, or what does modernism look like in America? Let us also take a look at that, right? So, in 1913, there was the Armory show that was put up, and that introduced the American poets to European artists such as Marcel Duchamp, Pablo Picasso, Henri Matisse, Paul Cézanne, and the others. Now, you see, all these are the names of very famous modernist European artists. And there was this exhibition called as the Armory Show that was put up in 1913 in America, that introduced the American poets to these European trends. Now, you see, it was also a time that was characterized by radical changes in the social, cultural, and economic spheres within US as well, right? But what we need to understand is that if we look at the time period, that modernism in America is an artistic movement that came into being in the early 20th century, right? And it's, I would say, it carried the essential features of its European counterpart. So, it's not that modernism in America was any different from how it was practiced in Europe, but yes, we all know that as a movement, modernism first came to Europe, and then of course it also influenced art and writing in America as well. Now, in this lecture, we looked at Carlos Williams's biographical background, where we see that where we said that he's an American poet who studied who studied medicine, but then went on to write poetry. Then we looked at the literary trend of Imagism, and how Carlos Williams, to an extent, subscribes to this trend. Then we discussed that one of the influences or some among some of the influences on Carlos Williams's work include Ezra Pound, Hilda Doolittle, and of course certain other European poet or British poets as well. Then we discussed about the idea of modernism and how modernism in America flourished, and how is, if at all, it is different from its European counterpart. So you see, and we also of course discussed a few features of the Imagist movement as well. Now, with all these thoughts, I would say that this, the background for the poet is set. Now, what we need to next do is to apply all these points, these ideas to the poetry that he actually wrote. So, in the next lecture, we are going to take up a poem by William Carlos Williams. We will discuss it at length, we will analyze it, and then also look at it thematically, plus in conjunction with the points that we have raised in this lecture. Thank you.